What began with a single, shocking incident has become an avalanche in Australian politics. The past 6 weeks has seen a once confident government unravel, and the miracle worker Prime Minister Scott Morrison fall from grace. But while the series of sexual abuse and harassment scandals may have been unexpected and unprecedented, the blundering, tone-deaf reaction from Scott Morrison that has so exacerbated these scandals was just the latest iteration of the Liberal Party's biggest flaw. If you were to ask the question, what makes a good Prime Minister? Students of Australian political history would be quick to tell you of key moments that defined governments, that defined our nation, moments of reflection, bravery and empathy, hard decisions made in the face of hierarchical power. In 1989, the Chinese government turned its tanks and soldiers on pro-democracy protesters in Tiananmen Square, whose numbers were over 1 million in the months prior. It's unknown how many people died in that violent crackdown. The Chinese government claims it was 200, but British intelligence puts the number potentially as high as 10,000. Australians watched as tears rolled down the face of Prime Minister Bob Hawke as he described the atrocities in Beijing. And then, unbeknownst to the press or even his cabinet, and knowing the full diplomatic consequences of this speech and what he was about to do next, Hawke offered immediate and unconditional asylum to 42,000 Chinese nationals in Australia. In 1996, in the tourist hub of Port Arthur, a gunman opened fire on a crowd, killing 35 people. Prime Minister John Howard flew to Canberra where he met with the survivors, many of which had lost partners, friends, children. Immediately after the incident, the Conservative government moved to introduce the most far-reaching gun reforms in Australia's history, banning military-style automatic and semi-automatic weapons and implementing a buyback scheme of any unregistered, illegal or unwanted firearms. But it was met by strong opposition by the gun lobby, who ran a ferocious campaign to stir up anger in rural and regional parts of Australia, putting pressure on the government, particularly in seats held by the Nationals. This schism would later give a foothold to One Nation, led by recently disendorsed Liberal candidate Pauline Hanson. MPs received death threats, letters with black targets printed on them, and one even had an empty grave dug next door to his home. But the fundamental moment was when John Howard confronted an angry mob in Victoria to defend his policies, despite being informed 2 hours earlier of a credible threat of assassination. John Howard was the first Prime Minister to wear a bulletproof vest on home soil. The point of these two stories is to show that these moments of empathy can be catalysts for change, potential crossroads in our country's journey. These moments had far-reaching consequences. Many of the Chinese Australians still have family here today or live here themselves, and we haven't had a mass shooting like that since. Now let's consider the moments that have defined the Morrison era. First, there was the 2020 bushfires, which he thought was the perfect opportunity to get away to Hawaii for a holiday. Why would he leave the country while half of it was on fire? The man people once thought was a political genius after his miracle victory over Labour last year was, well, now making amateur political blunders. Not only did he bizarrely try to cover it up, he also didn't understand that these moments are opportunities to reveal your humanity, to show the public you aren't just a suit. When he finally did return with his tail between his legs, we were treated to the infamous handshake blunders.
I don't really want to shake my hand. How are you?
I'm only shaking your hand if you give more funding to our RFS. So many people here have lost their homes.
Such a tour de force of political bumbling, it feels like it could be its own series on Masterclass. All he needed to do was stop, listen, empathise, and act with bravery. So like any good Liberal government, he hired an overpriced external contractor to act as an empathy consultant. $200,000 to tell you not to force people to shake your hand. Gee, I hope he kept his receipt. While his popularity as Prime Minister has bounced back through his handling of the COVID crisis and the rollout of stimulus policies, his biggest flaw has been laid bare this year. First, the Christian Porter rape allegation. Scott Morrison's staunch refusal to read the details of these allegations, coupled with his cold defence of innocent until proven guilty, and the rule of law, speaks to this broader misunderstanding of the deeper issues at play and a fundamental shortcoming in his emotional intelligence. This isn't about the technicals, it's about the vibe. There was no proper police investigation, and calls for an independent inquiry from the public and from friends of the deceased have been met with the same cold refusal. Christian Porter asked the press to imagine for a second that it wasn't true. And we should. We should have the empathy for him as a human being to give him the presumption of innocence, to allow for due process to take its course. But the problem is, it hasn't. Vice versa, what if we imagine, for a second, that it was true? And the stories revealed in that other older Ford Corners episode that shows Porter's disgraceful behaviour towards women while in university was just further evidence of his character. We can imagine for a second that the highest law officer in the land had committed this crime. Scott Morrison, then, as leader of this country, must understand an Attorney General must be beyond reproach. That this denial of an independent inquiry, which is a perfect opportunity to clear his name, as Bill Shorten's was, only perpetuates the vibes of a boys' club closing its ranks to protect one of its own. On the 30th of March, Porter was removed from the Attorney General position and was replaced with Michaelia Cash. But Porter still remains in Cabinet and is suing the ABC on claims of defamation. But the biggest blunder that we've seen from Morrison is his handling of the Brittany Higgins rape allegation. This wouldn't be the last time a Liberal staffer would be accused this year, though as of now, nothing has since come close to the severity of this case. This is normally when he'd refer to that $200,000 empathy consultant, but with the country now $700 billion in debt, he's just going to talk to Jenny. Now that's what I call fiscally responsible government.
She said to me, you have to think about this as a father first. What would you want to happen if it were our girls?
First of all, a grown man, let alone the Prime Minister, shouldn't need to consult with his wife about the morality of sexual assault. Secondly, why does he need to rationalise this empathy by making this about extensions of himself? As Grace Tame puts it,
it shouldn't take having children to have a conscience.
Yes, undoubtedly. It is easier to feel more strongly when it is about someone you know or when it's recontextualized like that, but you don't say that out loud, you absolute clown. You should feel empathy because she's a human being that you've met, that worked for you, not because you played pretend she was one of your offspring. And there's no way you could possibly make it worse.
Far from here, such marches, even now, are being met with bullets.
He really should have got Jenny to read over that one. It really takes a special kind of person to know that when people are shouting about a toxic culture and insulation of patriarchal power, your default response probably shouldn't be, well, you're lucky we don't just shoot you. These kinds of loosely veiled comparative threats seem to be his fight or flight response. Or in ScoMo's case, it's more like a smirk or shirk response. Except when a journalist asks him a difficult question, then his response is to weaponize a sexual assault claim.
Let me take you up on that. Right now, you'd be aware, in your own organisation, that there is a person who has had a complaint made against them for harassment of a woman in a women's toilet. You're free to make your criticisms and to stand on that pedestal, but be careful.
Aside from the fact that this claim was completely fictitious, you have to wonder what kind of a degenerate thinks it's okay to air this claim publicly without that person's permission. In a press conference being broadcast on every national news channel as a way of bullying a journalist into not asking a question. What a way to piss off the press. There is a pattern of abdication of responsibility.
You know, I don't hold a hose, mate.
The most recent tremendous example of this was in this cabinet reshuffle, which at this point is like rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic, where he announced that Marise Payne would be the new Minister for Women. Or as he eloquently puts it,
She is effectively the Prime Minister for Women, holding the prime ministerial responsibilities in this area as the Minister for Women.
well, now there's a Prime Minister for men and a Prime Minister for women. Now that's equality. Not only is he embracing the job-sharing economy, he's finally taking quotas seriously. Almost 50% of Labor's elected members are women? Get on my level, you absolute amateurs. Though we shouldn't be too surprised. It's quite typical of the Liberals expecting women to clean up their mess, whether it's their public image or something nasty left on a minister's desk. The biggest problem here is that Scott Morrison simply doesn't get it. It's further demonstrated with how he's failed to act decisively with Andrew Laming, who has multiple accusations against him for harassing women and taking an upskirt photo, which he admitted to over Facebook, and making light of his own subsequent apology. It is irrefutable that Laming should be sacked, and his female colleagues seem to agree.
I hope that Andrew makes the right decision. Because
you hope he goes?
I do. I think 17 years is a long time to be in Parliament, and I think he might like to reconsider his future.
So why won't he go? Because if he resigns from Parliament now, it would trigger a by-election in the seat of Bowman. And with Craig Kelly having already moved to the crossbench, it will reduce Scott Morrison's razor-thin margin into minority government. Instead, Morrison's solution is to send him on taxpayer-funded medical leave so he can undertake empathy training. Which is a great idea, except for the fact that empathy training doesn't work. While voluntary training can be successful, evidence shows that people that are force-fed these programs through work because of sexual assault, at best, come out wondering why the hell they were made to sit through that nonsense, or at worst, come out blaming the victim for their punishment. This seems to be another dud solution from Morrison's government, who have also suggested women fleeing domestic violence should draw on their super. Oh yeah, that'll help. Let's further financially fuck over women who have just been disproportionately affected by the recession brought on by COVID-19. I'll bet my non-existent YouTube revenue that this year's federal budget won't even acknowledge this fact, let alone propose policies to address it. But why doesn't Scott Morrison get this? Maybe if as a child he'd been exposed to more adversity and less Vicks vapor rub, the fumes would have melted his anterior insular cortex and he'd be capable of understanding why sexual assault is bad. Perhaps it was his time in the immigration portfolio, where he took the same pride in caging up downtrodden asylum seekers that a grade 3 teacher takes in teaching people to read, going so far as to have a custom boat trophy commission saying, "I stopped these." Maybe now he can have a trophy made up of a female staffer standing up in court with the same caption. Or just a bust of Malcolm Turnbull. Scott Morrison is refusing to take responsibility. Not for the actions of his party or his staff, no. Responsibility for the solution. In all of these examples, he just won't take on the emotional labour of these issues. And I think part of the reason is a perspective problem. Because he's seeing this as a problem for women when it isn't. This is a problem for men. It was created by men. It's a cultural rot that has begun at the head. And this is why I made this video. Because it is not women's responsibility to take on the mental, emotional and physical labour of solving these problems in Parliament and in society. It's not their job to come up with solutions, it is yours, Scott Morrison. The Brittany Higgins case, the desk wank saga, the big swinging dicks club. There needs to be systematic change, led by men, in consultation with women, guided by science and evidence, not by political convenience. This isn't a publicity issue to be managed. Scott Morrison is seeing this endemic as a marketing manager, as a public relations problem to be solved with spin and tokenistic apologies. He needs to stop and listen and empathise and make hard decisions, and there are plenty of things he could do. He could make Parliament a dry workplace. He could implement random drug and alcohol tests for members of Parliament. He could make his cabinet and all pre-selections 50% women. He could bring in harsher penalties for workplace misconduct. He could give the finance department the ability to dismiss staffers like Frank Zumbo that act inappropriately. He could have an independent body to deal specifically with sexual assault claims or harassment claims. He could bring in an independent commission against corruption while he's there. They need to make consent an integral part of the national curriculum, or better yet, put an end to single gender schools entirely. I'm sure it's just a coincidence that Andrew Laming, Christian Porter, Scott Morrison and a ton of Liberals all attended private boys' schools. History has shown us that our country has been made irrefutably better when Prime Ministers under pressure act with empathy first and make brave choices. But the question is, will Scott Morrison be remembered in history as a Howard or as a coward? Thanks for watching.